of all, I'd like to welcome everybody here to our first Burlington Housing Summit. And we're going to start out our day today with Mayor Bernie Sanders offering a few introductory remarks to get us going and hopefully to get us inspired for the day.
No, I'm not going to inspire you. I think what I want to say, first of all, is to congratulate Amy and the people who put together this meeting, because it's an important meeting. The fact of the matter is, and when you go down to the legislature, you recognize that even more clearly, is that what we are doing here in Burlington is infinitely further ahead than what the rest of the state is doing in a commitment for affordable housing and the rights of working people. Now, the fact of the matter is that I can't even say that within the legislature that there is a willingness or even an understanding of what the problem is. One of the ironies of what happens in political life is that very often it is talked about that there is a housing crisis in Burlington. And you know why it's talked about that there is a housing crisis in Burlington? Not because there is a housing crisis in Burlington, but because we in city government and in our community have had the guts to stand up and say there is a housing crisis in Burlington. People can't afford new housing. People can't afford skyrocketing rents. People are sleeping out on the streets. And we in Burlington have said that that problem is a responsibility that government should address. That we understand it is a very difficult problem, that it's a very expensive problem, but we're not going to let it slip under the rug. We are going to say that it's a problem that should be addressed. You know what? There is no housing problem in the state of Vermont. There's none. Governor Cunin doesn't acknowledge one. The state legislature doesn't acknowledge one. Therefore, there must not be a housing problem. But when you go down to Brattleboro, you find out that their rents are skyrocketing quite as quickly as they are in Burlington. When you go to trailer parks around the state of Vermont, you find that people are paying outrageous rents, that they don't have tenant protection, they're paying outrageous taxes, that in fact their trailers are not a good investment compared to new housing, and that's what they can afford. But it's not a crisis. And it's not a crisis because the legislature has not yet recognized it as a crisis. In point of fact, it may well be that we in Burlington will be spending more money in one form or another in the fight for affordable housing than the entire Vermont state government will be spending. Okay? We understand that in the terms of tenants' rights, we have led the fight. And we understand that in terms of housing improvement programs, we are so far ahead of the rest of the state as almost to be laughable. To be honest with you, when you go down to the legislature and you explain that in fact you want to fight so that people can live, low-income people, working people, can afford housing, and we want them to stay in our community, people don't understand what you're talking about. They think that it's a good idea that wealthy people come in and squeeze out poor people and working people. In point of fact, gentrification is often seen as a positive change in a community. We must be a successful community. Our poor people can't afford to live in Burlington anymore. And many communities around the state envy us. That's fantastic. You're getting rid of your poor people. And we say, no, we don't think that that's appropriate. In fact, we want to see more affordable housing built and more low-income housing built. And we're going to make that fight. Now, what we have done in the last few years through a variety of mechanisms, and you all know about this more than I do, we have spun off one group after another group, which is clearly coming up with the most innovative programs in the state. And I think the challenge before us now are in two major areas. Number one, what we have got to do and what this conference is about is bringing together the groups who have been working separately on the housing problem to make sure that we don't have duplication of effort and overlap of bureaucracy. Okay, we can't afford that. We just don't have enough money to have one group working over here and one group working there when we should be working together. And it's very important that we learn what each of our groups are doing. Second of all, in the midst of trying to deal with the enormous problems that we have on a day-to-day basis, whether it's the need for emergency shelters or family shelters, or the fight for tenants' rights, or the land trust, or whatever, we have also got to have the courage to take the very big view. In other words, what I'm saying to you is, don't just spend all of your energy responding to the immediate problems in front of you. Take the big view and look at where we want to be going in the future. And I think where we want to be going in the future, two major areas. And no one else is talking about this, so we may as well talk about it. We need to build thousands of units of affordable housing within Chittenden County, and many, many thousands of units of affordable housing have got to be built in the state of Vermont. Now, at every meeting of the Board of Aldermen, as we fight for tenants' rights, the developers and the landlords come in and they say, gee, the crisis is that, you're always bothering us to do this, inclusionary zoning and tenants' rights. That's not what the problem is. The problem really is that you need to build more housing. Now, as we all understand, unfortunately, they are not going to build that housing. Okay, they're too busy building condominiums and expensive housing. So who's going to build the thousands of units of affordable housing that need to be built? Who's going to do it? The University of Vermont's going to do it? They're not going to do it. State of Vermont's going to do it? They're not going to do it. Are people who can make a quick buck building $150,000 housing, $200,000 housing going to do it? They're not going to do it. Who's going to do it? Well, that's what you're going to have to solve. And I think it's going to be the public sector that's going to have to think about doing it. How do we leverage it? We have within the Vermont Housing Finance Agency now clearly the best people we've had there for years. And we're going to be dependent upon them, Alan and Brenda and their associates, for ideas as to how we finance these projects. How do we leverage city money? How do we put pressure on the banks? Who's gone into the banks lately and asked them where they're investing our money? Is it going to condominiums in Florida? Is it going to expensive housing in Stowe? Is it going to affordable housing in Chittenden County? Those are the hard questions that we've got to ask. And let me tell you, friends, I don't want to get you nervous. No one else in the state of Vermont is going to ask those questions. I'm going to ask those questions other than you. This is where the action is. But what we can do by raising that issue, by starting the effort to build affordable housing all over the state of Vermont, other people, tenants groups, working people, are going to also want to be part of that process. Yesterday, for example, in the legislature, something I'm very proud of. Do you remember the fight that we fought for the classification system of taxation, that fight we fought for 2 years? Well, now the legislature thinks it would be appropriate for all the communities in the state of Vermont to have that. Isn't that nice? That's good. Because we spent years fighting for that. And we win the battles for affordable housing here in Chittenden County, and we will embarrass the legislature and the governor. They will have to follow us. But obviously, the leadership is going to have to come right from this room. So that's the first effort. And let's not forget, while we deal with everything else, there is a crisis in terms of affordable housing. People are entitled to decent, safe, affordable housing. And clearly, the private sector is not going to do it. State government is not going to do it. We are going to have to figure out how do you build several thousand units of affordable housing. Second of all, of course, simultaneously, how do we keep housing affordable? It is important that an average working family has the opportunity to move into a home that's worth $60,000. That's important. Don't minimize that, please. That's a dream that many people have. Okay? My family went 18 years. They never had a home of their own. It's important that people have a home and a roof over their heads. That's not insignificant. Okay? But on the second hand, we also understand that with rents skyrocketing, with the value of housing skyrocketing, 20 years from today, a home that was affordable will no longer be affordable. What are the mechanisms? And certainly the Land Trust has been playing a leading role in that we keep housing affordable into the indefinite future. Those are the two issues, I think, the primary issues. I think we're making good progress on the emergency shelter issue, something we've got to keep going on. Many other issues we have, I think, within our Burlington Housing Authority now far and away the best commission and director that we've had in many years. Okay? So let me conclude by saying this. I think that we have an enormous amount to be proud of. Compared to what's going on around the rest of the state, we are miles ahead of them. We have won national recognition for our efforts. But the fight has just begun. Okay, the burden is on our shoulders. I trust that out of this meeting and meetings that will be coming in the next few months, we're going to come up with mechanisms to really take on the problem of affordable housing. And I promise you that the City of Burlington will be working with you every step of the way. Thank you very much.
I think I know almost everyone here, and I think that those of us in the Community and Economic Development Office have the opportunity to work with all of you. I'm not sure that all of you have the chance to work together on projects. That's one of the things that we hope this conference will be able to encourage. We're really happy that so many people could come. I'd like to take a few minutes now to talk about what you've told us the situation in Burlington is today. I hope everybody has gotten a copy of the responses to the Housing Summit questionnaire. I'd like to dispel a rumor first off. There's no difference between the copies that have red covers and the copies that have yellow covers. The information is the same. There are more copies, and if you don't have one, if you don't have one, why don't you raise your hand and we'll try and pass them out to you. Okay. I'm going to start with just stating that there's no question that the nonprofit development community has momentum and has been gaining strength over the years. We asked you how long your organization had been in existence, and the organization that's been in existence the longest has been in existence since 1791, but that's the university, so we're not going to count them. We're going to move on to the first organization in Burlington that began developing nonprofit housing, which was the Burlington Housing Authority in the early 60s. It was the first nonprofit organization in Burlington. It was followed by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, the Vermont State Housing Authority, and the BEAM organization, which all organized in the late 60s. The Housing Finance Agency and the Housing Authority developed affordable housing opportunities and subsidies primarily for the for-profit development community and for single-family homes in their initial stages. We're seeing now a switch and an encouragement of nonprofit development so that when we build affordable housing, it stays affordable, and that's a real encouraging trend. In the 70s, the Winooski Community Development Corporation was formed, and the Cathedral Square Corporation was formed. Now, Cathedral Square still owns and operates its housing. Winooski Housing Authority built, both of these programs built housing using the federal subsidy programs that were available through the 70s that we all look back and remember very fondly. And Cathedral Square, as we all know, has one of the largest numbers of nonprofit housing stock in the state. In the 80s, when federal resources were drying up and virtually everybody was turning their back on housing as an impossible issue to deal with, we in Burlington began 8 organizations to work on the housing issues. We started in 1981 with Vermont Tenants, who had a purpose of protecting and providing advocacy services for tenants in Burlington and also statewide. And we're happy to see that the VTI is now working with the Land Trust and other organizations on our cooperative housing efforts in an effort to move out from tenant services to providing some opportunities for lifelong tenants to become owners and control their housing. In 1982, the Committee on Temporary Shelter and Northgate Tenants Association formed. We all know why the Committee on Temporary Shelter formed. We all saw the people who had no place to live in our city. We still see it. Northgate Tenants Organization began as an organization to build their community out at Northgate Apartments, which is 336 apartments, the largest housing complex in the state. They now have an additional task in front of them because their mortgage, their 20-year mortgage and their low-cost housing is threatened with the possible sale to high-cost rentals and condominiums. In 1984, the Burlington Community Land Trust and the Lake Champlain Housing Development Corporation were formed. Now, the Land Trust from the start formed with the idea of being here forever to provide perpetually affordable housing. It was a radical step from some of our initial efforts to provide housing, where we're saying when we provide housing in our community, we're going to develop a mechanism that keeps that affordable for the families that come after the initial family and for the families after that. The Lake Champlain Housing Development Corporation started out by providing rental subsidies and renovation money for landlords in the greater Burlington area, Burlington, Winooski, South Burlington, and Colchester. We found, not to much of anyone's surprise, that to get South Burlington and Colchester to provide affordable housing wasn't going to happen unless we made it happen. And the Lake Champlain Housing Development Corporation now owns and operates a 32-unit building out in Colchester, probably Colchester's first and only affordable housing. First of many affordable housing projects in Colchester. In 1986, the Women's Consortium for the Construction of Housing began as a group of women who were concerned about what was happening to women in the community in Burlington, where were their housing needs being met, and how could we strengthen the opportunities for women economically in our community. The Vermont Energy Investment Corporation also began in 1986. This corporation intends to help with probably the major costs of most of our housing beyond the mortgage, which is the skyrocketing cost of energy, and how can we keep our housing affordable by keeping our energy costs affordable. In 1987, and still to be formed, still in the formation stages, the Local Ownership Corporation formed as an economic development corporation, which sees housing as very closely tied in with economic opportunity. And as I look at Jim Hokins, who's done most of the work on the Local Ownership Corporation, I realize that the Burlington Youth Employment Program, which has been steadily building housing over the last 4 years, is not included in my list here. And maybe you can tell us when we started, Jim, how long you've been here.
Since May of 1983, but our first project in Atlanta was in 84
Altogether, these housing organizations own 671 housing units out of a total of approximately 7,000 housing units in Burlington. We all recognize that that's not enough, and that's why we're here. We're trying to build over the next 2 years more housing and build on the existing housing we have to make sure that it maintains its affordability. I think I'd just like to echo what Bernie says, that unlike the state and the federal government, the city recognizes that we have a housing crisis and we want to do something about it. Our next area that we asked you in your housing questionnaire was what your goals are for the next 2 years. Now, some organizations have very specific goals, I think you'll see, and others are uncertain about what their goals will be. We're hoping that this conference will help those organizations with uncertain goals work with the existing organizations and formalize what they hope to accomplish in the next 2 years. We hope we can use the summit to clarify what we all are trying to do jointly. I think it's going to be a challenging 2 years because a low estimate among all of you of the units that you hope to develop in the next 2 years is 875 units. Now, this is more than we've done in the last 25 years. I think it's great. The high estimate is over 1,000, with many organizations uncertain as to where their particular direction is going to be. As our goals become clarified and we start looking at what we want to accomplish, we have to really look at the capacity and the ability of our nonprofits, of all of us, to carry out all the goals that we want to carry out. There wasn't any organization, unfortunately, that said they had no problems. If you recall asking which were the most difficult or the most difficult development questions, there was no organization that said that they found it all a snap. But what was very interesting was that organizations found different things to be most difficult. Some organizations found the rehabilitation side to be the most difficult part of development. Some people found the financial packaging. Some people found that the need for equity was the most difficult piece. And what we're hoping we can do in this conference is use our strengths, see if we can tap the strengths in certain organizations in certain areas and build an overall capacity among all of us. We hope you'll look at, in your workshops, ways we can coordinate activities to become more efficient in carrying out our goals. This brings me to the point of our summit today, and we really have 3 purposes. We'd like these purposes to carry through all of the workshops that we're doing. Our first purpose is to look at our common goals and activities, to have a chance to see the whole picture of what's going on in Burlington and how our organizations fit in with this, what other people are doing, what's happening here in Burlington. The second is we'd like us in each of our workshops to make recommendations among ourselves as to how we might be able to function more efficiently. What resources could we share? Can we share staff? Can we share development financing skills? What expertise can we use better? What do we still need to develop? What systems will work across organizations and help make our jobs easier? The third purpose of our summit is the recommendations we have for others, maybe the more fun one. What recommendations do we have to the city as it formalizes its housing goals? What recommendations do we have to the state, our congressional legislation, and others? So we'd like you to look at the common goals first, see what we're doing, fit yourself into the whole picture. We'd like you to make recommendations for those of us who make up the nonprofit housing development community, and we'd like you to make recommendations to the city, the state, and others of what we could do. And what we're going to do is we're going to break up, when I'm finished speaking, we're going to break up into our workshops, and we're going to ask that each workshop, we're very fortunate that members of the Burlington Mediation Project are here in case things get out of hand. But we're not calling them mediators, we're calling them our moderators, and they will be leading our discussion groups. We're asking in each of our workshops that you keep these three goals in mind and that you report back at the end of the day in our wrap-up session on each of these goals. The workshop format is going to be providing some time initially for introduction of who we are individually and who we're representing as an organization, since a lot of people wear a lot of different hats in this world. And we're going to be asking for a 50-minute discussion period and then a 15 to 20-minute time period to wrap up and provide some written, as I say, written information for the final wrap-up session where we'll be talking as a whole group again. What we're asking is that the workshop that you're in have a volunteer. We're asking the moderators to ask for a volunteer to be the note taker and the recorder and the reporter.
Let's start. I'm Michael Monty, and I'm from the Community Development Office. Just to reintroduce myself, and I was asked to moderate this last hour, an hour and 15 minutes of this day. And just to let you know that hopefully we'll be out of here by 4:15. Okay, if that's a reasonable amount of time. If we all need more time, we could say that. But at this point, 4:15 will be the end point. I put an agenda up here. What we'd like to do is some workshop reports, and these are as brief as you can humanly make possible. Okay, I think that since the mic is up here, is this working? Since the mic is up here, what we want to be able to do is since the mic is up here, we like to have a reporter from each workshop come up here and be able then to speak into the mic. And I'll call off it and try to cut you off so that there's enough time so we get to everybody. So the recorder from the first workshop, Obstacles to Development, who's that? Kirby Dunn.
Obstacles to development. Basically what we did was we took this topic, we broke it down into 5 sections that included how to find a site, how to finance it, construction management, filling the units, and keeping it affordable. We spent a lot of time sort of listing the problems, which we all knew very well, and unfortunately we didn't spend any time at all sort of putting them together and figuring out the solutions. So I think I'm just going to sort of go through and just try and pinpoint some of the major solutions that we came up with in each of those sections.
A few
minutes. Okay, under finding a site, there were a number of basic needs that seemed to arise. We needed an inventory of what was out there, what was available. We needed a clearinghouse to really hook up the housing providers with the owners, the sellers, and tenants who possibly wanted to move in. One thing that was really needed by nonprofits was really needing the time and the money to put deals together, which we don't seem to have enough of either. A specific recommendation dealt with the staffing for both planning and zoning and streamlining that process for nonprofits especially. On financing the projects. It seems that we've been able to put together some amazing financial deals, but we're still not able to put it together to make it cheap enough to provide housing for the people that need it the most. Housing's expensive, even if we are nonprofit, even if we have subsidies, even if we have all the resources possible put together. A specific recommendation that was brought up was dealing with CDBG. There's a long application period, makes it expensive, cutting that process, the time of that process. It was really pointed out that there are a lot of people around who don't really want to sell their homes or their buildings to speculators, and there again we came up with the issue of the clearinghouse and needing to hook up people who wanted to sell with resources such as ours, nonprofits, instead of putting it back into the speculative market. Those are some of the major points there. How do you manage construction? We talked about using the existing condominium conversion ordinance as a way of pinpointing units that were coming on the market. There was a lot of talk of the need for construction management. I think we heard in a number of different workshops, and VIC doing it, and the Land Trust doing it, and all the nonprofits that had need for it. There was a suggestion of developing specifically construction management services in the line of Kessel Duff, but for nonprofits. Some of the major points there. Filling and marketing units didn't seem to be a major problem. It seemed that there's certainly enough people out there who were available to take the units that came on. One of the main issues that seemed to arise was in terms of cooperatives, how to get the people to take advantage of the situations that we all want to develop in terms of co-op housing. And again, the issue arose of needing a clearinghouse to set people up with the various housing needs that they had. And there was a stress that we wanted to do mixed income housing, and that sometimes there is a difficulty in marketing that. Under the issue of how to keep it affordable, we seem to sort of know how to keep it affordable, but the problem was mostly getting it affordable. And that went back to the issues around financing. One thing that was talked about was the need to, in keeping it affordable, was to stabilize the costs that we don't seem to have control over, such as property taxes, energy costs, water costs, things of that type. There were a number of recommendations made here in terms of waiving permit fees for nonprofits, waiving property transfer tax for nonprofits, raising ANC allotments to give people more money to be able to afford their housing, and capitalizing community loan funds for options for the upfront costs instead of just for mortgages. And that was pretty much that, unless someone else has. There was a lot. If I missed something, please feel free.
Identifying needs in Burlington. I think maybe we'll keep the general discussion in the general discussion phase. There'll be probably a lot of ties between workshops. Identifying needs in Burlington, Recorder.
We divided our discussion into two basic areas: who is underserved, and then what to do to change that. You've heard all of this before. Low-income families, women head of households, large families with 4 or 5 kids, young mentally disabled singles, people who need 2 or 3 bedrooms, specifically the elderly and disabled, older people not eligible for subsidized housing, i.e. moderate elderly housing. Security was mentioned in that part of the discussion. Then we talked about what are the barriers that people have to using the services of the agencies present. Elderly, disabled, and women head of households need to be included in the planning of developing housing. The people do not know where to look for what they need. Outreach is needed, and also a sharing of resources. The suggestion was made that Burlington needs a clearinghouse, one-stop shopping for coordinated agency services. The review and permit process for development and review is a barrier to getting projects through. Then we talked about what we could do together, networking. Suggestion was made, the state of Maine has a housing hotline, either 1-800 number or possibly 2 or 3 if one agency couldn't provide the one number. We need financing from the private sector to create housing that the users have control of their housing. Populations and agencies need to educate the financial community about the creditworthiness of their groups, of nonprofits in particular. The need to put pressure on state government, and the need to present solutions as a coalition, i.e. the Affordable Housing Task Force. Packaging information, whether it's centralizing agency services for low-income tenants or packaging the permit services for development. And last but not least, who will do it, whatever it is, and how. And the suggestion was made to have some kind of an ombudsman, that one organization for all of Greater Burlington would certainly be helpful. That people need to know specifically what each organization is, what area each organization covers specifically. And the need for someone to look at the larger picture and get beyond the limited resources. For instance, as a model, the League of Cities and Towns, which serves all the municipalities in the state. The need to know more about the needs and who would be responsible for finding out what the needs are, and have them not only quantified but also prioritized. And how that responsibility will be distributed. Who can commit the resources, and that the private sector should be included. I haven't left out anything important.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Great. Fundraising? Introduce who you are.
My name's Aileen Lax, and I work for Vermont Tenants Incorporated. So this is a report on the fundraising committee, which it's difficult to give because we really went over a lot of information. Basically, what I got out of the committee was, or the meeting was, that there were different areas targeted in which we could cooperate in terms of fundraising efforts, and that there were certain barriers that people noted that were in the way of cooperating and making that possible. And then we also went into some suggestions about how it would be that we could overcome those barriers and some of the things that maybe we could do. And we didn't really get into the specifics of how practical or realistic they might be. We went from, wish lists to maybe more practical things. People talked about, in terms of the areas to cooperate, we talked about the skills involved with grant writing, for example, that there would be a way to pool those, that there would be joint applications for funds, that also there would be information shared about what funding sources were available, and information shared about financial establishments that might provide funding. And also that there might be, to move away from grants, since grants are not the only way to get money, that there might be more creative ways to use each other's resources, in a sense bartering or something, so that we don't have to constantly be applying for grants or depending on grants. Some of the barriers that I heard people refer to were, one, that there are turf issues. If someone starts a project, they may want to make sure that they complete that project, and they don't necessarily want to farm out a piece of it to someone else. A response to that discussion was that, and another barrier kind of to look at, is that in some cases it's the philosophy that's different amongst organizations, and one organization that has a vision about a project may not want to farm out a piece of it because they feel that their vision is going to be not really carried through because that other organization doesn't share the same philosophy. And so we were talking about the issue of specializing, basically. And the other issue that was raised in terms of a barrier to doing that was that a lot of the organizations that were all present in this discussion were providing many different services, and that they couldn't really specialize in one because they would be falling short in the other services that they were providing already. That also organizations are not necessarily clear about what they can or can't do, so that they could communicate that to someone else to say, hey, could you do this piece? And not clear about the resources available. And that also there was a lack of money and staff who could do the front work to find out what resources are available and to make the connections, let's say with the private sector, what kind of financing or what kinds of resources are available. In terms of the suggestions, we had many. We talked about there being an ombuds person as well, that there be this czar of housing who would oversee and connect everybody, the resources, the skills, the money, everything else that they needed. Just go down the yellow brick road. And that there would be this organization that would do all your grant writing. Just call them up and say, we need this much money for this project by this date, and it will be done. Y'all like that idea?
I like that idea.
Yep. And then we'd also have maybe a database, and we were talking about how the city and also University of Vermont and the state might be able to be helpful, and the database was something that I think those are the agencies or organizations that might be able to provide that database about different funding sources available, also a database about the apartment units, etc., and also trying to link up private organizations with nonprofits, so that maybe there would be a way to connect the two, private industry, etc., that have certain resources that nonprofits need and don't have access to and don't know about. Let me see what else there might have been. A newsletter and regular meetings to try to keep communication going amongst people around fundraising issues. And I guess the round table that already exists on a statewide level, there was talk of expanding that to include people other than agency heads who currently participate in it. I don't know, there was probably more, but that's what comes to mind right now. I'll stop there.
Okay. Building by building organizing.
My name's Rennie Crew, and I'm with Vermont Tenants Incorporated. And it was a very disjointed discussion that I really got a lot out of. Interestingly enough, whether or not I can say that to you and what it is I got out of it, I can say I'm not sure, but I will try. First of all, building by building organization was there were sort of two camps that was happening. Some people thought that building by building organization, specifically nonprofit building by building organization for nonprofits, and how nonprofits would be able to work with their tenant organizations. And the other was a larger context of building by building organization in the city, in the state, in the country. The workshop was set up as to, it said needs, barriers, and who, who being the solutions. The needs seemed to be, well, first there was people to do the organizing and money for people to do the organizing, whether it be within the context of the nonprofits and their units or in the larger context. Also, educational programs for tenants. Tenants being in this culture, you know, of one home and one homeowner, how to adapt and to have a model for cooperative ownership and to be able to work collectively and do property collectively is an issue. And again, money came up in terms of who. Some people, such as the land trust, who were a large voice in that, had issues around how to organize tenants and be a thank you so much, benevolent landlords, and have enough time to get things done. So in terms of staff time, it took up so much staff time to work in this context, which moves me right into barriers. The barriers were the inexperience of the tenants, the lack of the staff time, legal issues, which I was unaware that South Meadow had been proposed as a cooperative and legally was unable to get that status. And I'd be interested more in that, and let's discuss that. Lack of broad-based coalitions in terms of tenant organizing and collectivity and cooperatives. Lack of models. The who was kind of interesting. There were again, it came up in terms of who was going to do this, and each thing that was proposed, people seemed to have issue with, and I think it was because there were different agendas. But somebody proposed that the city government, that there would be someone through the city government to sort of work on these issues, and other people said that it would definitely be, inherently be not possible. Can anyone else help me with some of the solutions? Because there were more.
A grant proposal that BTI and Land Trust had gone in on together for somebody to do essentially tenant services or tenant organizing for the Land Trust, that person being within BTI, and then the need for BTI to gather more resources on a more citywide level, building by building and citywide issues, to do more organizing on that level, and to perhaps use a voter registration, tenant education type project to make that happen. The other thing we discovered was that there's this incredible database that's out there that lists every rental unit and the owner that BED has, Burlington Election Department has. Yeah. It's around. But that there is a listing of every house in the city and the owner of that house, the rental unit, number of units, and all that, and we just have to fill in the blank on who the tenants are. And city has it. Nobody knew that, I don't think. Or a couple of people knew that. All right.
Chip Castle with the Office on Aging. The focus of our workshop was to determine the division of labor between nonprofit development organizations and long-term property owners. We broke the focus into three areas, three questions. First of all, what are the common goals and activities of organizations as they relate to the issue? Secondly, what recommendations can we make for community projects on sharing of resources? And third, what ways can others, for example, state or local government or other funding agencies, assist nonprofits in reaching their goals in this area? Under common goals and activities, we talked about a lot of stuff. One premise being anytime public funds are invested in projects for affordable housing, that they remain with affordable housing. I think this is something that the state at large has painfully learned. To lock into the project for long-term affordability any subsidies or public funds that were used. Another goal is to know what is available for assistance and who does what. Again, going on the clearinghouse idea that seemed to come from just about every workshop that I was at today. Another idea, be able to connect organizations with each other. For example, one organization with a good idea to solve a housing problem using another couple organizations' expertise to reach their goal. Sharing of resources. Organizations need to share varied areas of expertise. Use of groups like the Land Trust to permanently lock in subsidies. Use of development resources of others. In other words, not recreating the wheel every time you come up with a brilliant idea. Joint grant writing. the Housing Finance Agency creating a nonprofit wing or arm. It was a wing or an arm. Whereby, with no charge, there would be help for nonprofit groups in the pre-development financial packaging area. One thing was mentioned that just in the area of construction management, for example, there was at least 3 of us all here that had people on staff that handle construction management, and couldn't there be some way of sharing the expertise that various groups have? We spent quite a bit of the rest of the discussion on Northgate, an immediate problem, and talked about the need for help, what is going on, what else needs to be done to help Northgate, and I saw a couple of people come up and talk with one person from Northgate, and hopefully something's coming out of this further help there. The last section we talked about was state or local governments, what should others be doing, and one idea was dollars for capacity building from the city of Burlington to make available for startup funds for tenant organizations. The state needs to support development in similar fashions. It was mentioned that the state does have an up and running program in the block grant program available for planning and development activities. And also, one issue was talked about was that the state needs to start selling the idea of the affordable housing crisis in terms of a media blitz, so that towns would be educated in terms of the crisis in their own towns for affordable housing. And finally, that the state needs or should look into the community development block grant program to try to make it more palatable to towns in terms of accepting affordable housing solutions at the community level. Okay.
And last but not least, property management. Gerhard?
My name is Erhard Monke. I'm with Winooski Community Development, and we broke down the first thing we tried to do is establish what is property management, what sort of tasks are a part of property management, and some of the things that some of the sort of more typical things that came out were collection of rents, enforcement problems for late rents or non-payment of rents, general maintenance, inspections of properties, accounting, bookkeeping, bill paying on the project, creation of and maintenance of a waiting list, tenant selection from the waiting list, and all the way to provision of social services, referrals to different agencies that could help with individual tenant problems, counseling, health counseling, all the way through to Cathedral Square, for example, providing meals to some of its tenants. Other items that were listed were in cooperative housing situations. The management would encompass even the training of the tenants to self-manage in the future, 24-hour emergency on-call service, and interpersonal conflict resolution. Different organizations out there with management needs have very different management needs, and there's a spectrum of those from sort of your bare bones maintenance and inspections, collections, and accountancy, which maybe a self-managing co-op might need, all the way to a senior citizens housing center or a housing project that had a number of disabled or handicapped tenants, which would obviously need a lot of social service backup. We also spent some time looking at who in the area was currently set up to do management, and it seemed that basically that was the housing authorities in both Burlington and Winooski, Cathedral Square Corporation. In the future, it looks like the Local Development Corporation is going to be able to provide that service. And currently, on sort of an ad hoc basis, there's a couple of nonprofits that are forced into the situation of having to do their own management, like Lake Champlain does some of its own management, BYEP, the Land Trust, and Winooski Community Development as well. the needs seem to be strongest from among the groups that are currently doing what I would call, or what we called ad hoc management. Basically, the debate there is, do these groups continue to struggle with doing this in-house, or do they contract for services with some of the agencies that are currently set up to do management? We debated the pros and cons of that. The pros of doing in-house management, or that you have a little bit of extra income that you can put into your administrative budget, and the obvious downside of that is that it's an inefficient use of land trust staff time, or my staff time in Winooski Community Development, for example. One of the main problems seemed to be, as always, funding and financing, and whether or not a project has enough fat in it to provide proper management. What happens when a project doesn't have enough funding in it to provide proper management? You kind of wing it and do what you need to do, and you can't contract for services. The consensus seemed to be that sort of a break-even point for an organization to be able to exist purely from management was about managing about 100 to 125 units in that general vicinity. A management agent or company could basically survive off the fees that they would collect. We spoke also about some solutions, and there again, typically, one of the major focuses was to provide pooling of some of the things that people are already doing as part of the scope of their own operations. Pooling, for example, social services. There are some groups like Cathedral Square, like BHA, that have social workers on staff, and then there's other agencies like Tim, for example, who's doing a lot of counseling but can't really do it. So maybe we could get together and pool those, work out a way for pooling those services, pooling waiting lists and screening procedures, and pooling maintenance services. Again, some organizations have in-house maintenance, some contract for maintenance, and perhaps we could arrange to share some of those services. It was also mentioned the mediation project could be a very good resource in helping, particularly with tenant conflicts and tenant-landlord type conflicts, which make management more difficult and messier than just collecting bills and paying bills. And also the local development corporation, when it forms, would hopefully be able to provide the services, the management services, cheaper because of their ability to use Burlington Youth Employment Program workers and also workers from the Women's Economic Opportunity Program. I think that there were a lot of other things there, but if I missed anything, I don't know, anyone else who participated in it help me out. I think I've basically covered it.
Great. Thanks. Round of applause for recorders. No? It's not easy to do that. Get up and try to figure out what we all said. Now it's just time for general discussion recommendations, specifically the next steps. And so it's an open discussion for the next 20 minutes or so. I'd like to spend some time for evaluation. So if people want to be recognized.
Two comments. One is in terms of information. I know the finance agency participated with some other agencies in financing something called, correct me if I'm wrong, Chittenden County Housing Resource Guide. Seems to me that is a basic, fairly extensive piece of information. People don't have them. They're readily available in a lot of areas. A lot of us have them. So let's not recreate the wheel. I mean, we may want to supplement or add on to it or change it, but that may be a good starting point. Secondly, it seems to me that, we all talk about the other communities in this county. and I could be wrong in saying this, I'm not aware of any sort of organized effort to educate and inform them. Maybe it'd be worth holding a regional forum using Burlington and Winooski as communities who could present what they've done, but do it in sort of a informative, friendly way rather than constantly criticizing them. I mean, I certainly think they deserve criticism, but I don't think they're going to react to criticism. And I've had conversations with a number of those communities, and I think they would welcome that possibility or that opportunity to learn what Burlington and Winooski have done. And it may not happen overnight, but I think you've got to start someplace, and that may be the place to start.
Express sort of a sense that I have of the day and the feeling I got, which is that there seems to be, which is very encouraging to me, an embracing of the kind of pulling together we're going to have to do in the face of the federal cutback and the former sort of ways of thinking about dealing with housing on a societal level, which is involved with providing incentives to for-profit developers and that kind of thing. And I'm just real happy to see the coming together of the notion that non-profit and community-based and motivated development is getting the same kind of cohesive attention that I'm sure that the American home builders and whatnot bring to their skill and their craft and their primary motivation, which is to foster the notion of housing as commodity and the commodification of housing as a profit-driven thing. And I think we've got tremendous talent and tremendous potential and energy and collective all of the above. And I'm just that's the thing that I like the most about this kind of thing. Because we really are going to have to bring another whole set. We're going to have to make it up as we go. Really, another whole set of ideas and concepts and motivations around housing as shelter. And,
Okay, does anybody else want to?
we can do it.
Sorry.
Definitely.
Does anybody else want to speak to what could have been better or what was bad about the day, besides that there was no dessert at lunch?